From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, Government and Academia, the Uneasy Bond.
I'm Peter Hackus in Washington. In a democracy, public projects paid for with public tax money are generally monitored by the government, federal, state, or local, to make sure those projects are run for the benefit of everyone. Most colleges and universities, unable to sustain themselves entirely, accept government funding of some kind. Over the years, the question has been asked, in return for those funds, how much government regulation is necessary to guarantee their proper use? At what point do government rules restrict academic freedom? Used with restraint, are some government regulations helpful to an institution of learning? Or is it an unwarranted intrusion into the learning process for government, for example, to dictate requirements for student admission, for faculty hiring, research procedures, and in some cases, even the curriculum? If, as some have said, it is perfectly proper for government to exercise some controls, where then is the line to be drawn? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Our roundtable discussion will consider the topic, Government and Academia, the Uneasy Bond. Appearing on the panel are the Honorable David Matthews, President of the University of Alabama. Dr. Matthews served as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Ford administration. That's the federal agency with jurisdiction over aid to education. Dr. Matthews is the author of several articles on American higher education. The Honorable Robert Wood, former President of the University of Massachusetts. Dr. Wood served as Undersecretary and later as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development from 1966 through 1969. He is now associated with the Joint Center for Urban Studies of Harvard and MIT. Robert Goldwyn is an AEI resident scholar and director of seminar programs. He served as special consultant to President Ford, with duties including maintaining liaison between the White House and the academic community. Dr. Goldwyn was Dean of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland from 1969 to 1973. Stephen Gray Bart is editor of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of its journal, Daedalus. Dr. Gray Bart is also professor of history at Brown University. John Charles Daly will moderate the discussion at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa in conjunction with AEI's Academic Outreach Program. Mr. Daly is a former news correspondent and news commentator for CBS and ABC News. He has served as vice president of the ABC network and once headed the Voice of America. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with government and academia, the uneasy bond. To set the scene, when Congress 20 years ago debated the National Defense Education Act, Senator Barry Goldwater noted what modern argot would call the camel's nose in the tent syndrome and prophesied, quote, "If adopted, this legislation will mark the inception of aid, supervision, and ultimately control of education in this country by federal authorities." Well, on the basis of the experience of these past 20 years or so, there is growing fear in academia that Senator Goldwater may be right. Although there are at least a dozen major pieces of federal legislation that now govern various aspects of college and university life, there is no historic act of Congress mandating federal scrutiny of higher education, and there is no government agency that has as its mission the regulation and supervision of the academy. Indeed, a substantial area of friction between the academy and government is concerned with the accountability for public funds and compliance with laws and regulations such as the Occupational Safety and Health Act, sweet OSHA, minimum wage laws, and so forth, to which all corporate entities and employers are subject. The basic uneasiness between government and the academy, however, lies in the perceived menace to academic freedom, government intrusion in such areas as faculty hiring, student admissions, curriculum, and research, which Harvard's Derek Bok calls the principal academic functions of higher education. Principal menace in the conflict may well be affirmative action, a labyrinth of laws, directives, and regulations that circumscribe, sometimes compromise, historic rights of the academy. Many in the educational community think universities and colleges today are used as instruments for the pursuit of social gains that have little or no relationship to quality education. So Dr. Matthews, as a former secretary of HEW and president of the University of Alabama, you have faced the issue of the uneasy bond from both perspectives. Just how burdensome is regulation, federal and state, on the academy?
I think probably the best word to describe it would be excessively burdensome. But I don't think that the uneasy bond is anything new. I think for the educational community to assert that it is now all of a sudden invaded by the public domain is to forget its history. If the bond is uneasy, it has always been uneasy. Education is not a self-generating force. It's a creation of society to serve certain purposes, and it has always been, and I think properly been, very much entwined with the public will. That, in fact, has given it its vitality. I don't decry affirmative action. I don't decry the use of the government to direct education onto paths that are socially meaningful. But I do question the methods that we are currently using. I question them on the grounds not only of what they're doing to the academic community, but on the grounds of what they're doing to the government. And I come to the conclusion, as I said initially, that the intrusion is counterproductive, not just from the point of view of the institutions involved, but from the point of view of the public.
All right, Dr. Wood, you too have served as a presidential cabinet secretary, as secretary of HUD, and as university president at the University of Massachusetts. Do institutions of higher education warrant exemption from the kinds of regulation we impose on other institutions in our society?
No, they don't warrant exemption in my judgment. They warrant understanding for the kind of special, strange creatures they are. They warrant understanding about the complexity of the academy, its public-private mix, its division between colleges and universities, its history, as Dave has indicated, that goes back 100 years in at least land-grant universities with a very cordial and symbiotic relationship with the Department of Agriculture and other federal agencies. But it cannot claim a special privilege when the society or the government has determined certain goals of equality and openness and fairness in our society.
All right, Dr. Goldwyn, as former dean of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, whose curriculum leadership is legendary, do you feel the government has honored the stern prohibition barring any department, agency, officer, or employee of the United States from exercising any direction, supervision, or control, which is basic in federal education statutes?
No, they haven't honored it, and in fact, it's an impossible pledge to honor. There's no way that they can do what they intend to do by regulation without having some control, some direction, some interference, and sometimes more than a little, a great deal, over the essential activities of a college or university. I agree with David Matthews that the relationship of government and educational institutions is a very old one, as old as society. But when we speak of a bond, we're speaking now of a very strange and excessive mixture of government action with the educational enterprise, and I think it's dangerous.
All right. Dr. Gray Bart, as a distinguished editor in the educational firmament and a professor, what has been the effect of social regulations, such as requiring equal treatment of the sexes, affirmative action, and controls on scientific experimentation?
Well, it's had several effects, the most important of which is, of course, that it has changed the complexion of student bodies in universities. It has changed in certain ways, and I don't only speak of complexion in racial terms, but in other terms as well. It has changed the complexion of faculties. It has made students, faculties, others more aware of certain conditions that obtained before that no longer obtain to the same degree. At the same time, obviously, in respect to regulation of experimentation and other such matters, and as you know, regulation is based upon hundreds of different legislative and administrative acts. At the same time, something else has happened that has been very important and very interesting. People have become aware of the federal presence in higher education in a way that they couldn't have been before, for there was no such presence before. All public institutions were always aware of what state legislators and state bodies did. But in the year 1930, nobody thought of what Herbert Hoover was doing in respect to universities. Perhaps nobody thought of Herbert Hoover in those days. But in any case, what is obvious is that such regulation, as we know today, simply didn't exist in a period before just a decade ago.
Well, to come to grips with the many facets of this whole issue, Charles Saunders, the Director of Governmental Relations at the American Council on Education, says, "The challenge facing American universities is not merely to learn how to cope with federal regulation, but to develop new mechanisms for self-regulation." Is there an answer in that statement to the problems which you see, even though what I sense here is that it's understandable there should be some federal participation? There is some concern that the methodology and perhaps the frames of reference are beginning to be intrusive.
Well, there's no question that at an earlier time, colleges and universities had the opportunity to regulate themselves to achieve the kinds of aims that the federal government and other public bodies are now imposing upon them. For reasons that are historical and complex and that I shall not try to enumerate, very minor efforts were made in this regard. Inevitably, you then had the imposition of many of the kinds of regulations that now exist. There is no question that many within universities and outside universities are very dubious about certain of these regulations. But it is very hard in some instances to change them. In other instances, it is hard to get agreement on alternatives that would achieve the same objectives. And in some instances, there is simply a constant insistence that they're not working without any political protest that matters to legislators. In other words, there are individuals or groups that are unhappy, but you don't have this translated into political protest that makes legislators or administrators move in another direction.
It might help if we got a little bit specific on what seems to hurt from the academic point of view and what seems to be accepted. I think it's clear that most of our faculties have been very grateful for federal research dollars over the years, beginning with agriculture, after World War II in the sciences and engineering, and indeed for the great research universities, between 1/5 and 1/4 of all their budgets really flow from this side, and sort of reluctantly, universities have come to understand and deal with the so-called red tape of how you handle research grants and contracts, and somewhat reluctantly, university presidents have become inured to the fact that distinguished faculty members will have a contract and will travel, and that the priorities of a university go out the window once someone's got a $2 billion grant from Washington on his own. That part is treated reasonably wholesomely. And Where the rub comes, of course, and has come, is the point you identified at the beginning, particularly with affirmative action. And this flies in the face of what has always been regarded in faculty life as a peer group prerogative. Now, in 1960, there were 19% of the faculties of the universities of this country were women. In 1972, it's 19.1%. And there has been, and at least as I see it, both in terms of the recruitment of women and the recruitment of blacks, a thoroughly conservative, thoroughly stand pat attitude on the part of the great universities and colleges of this country. And if
there are some arguments, some analyses that have been made of why that is so, with all of the affirmative action efforts, why the numbers of women in academic positions has not increased.
No,
it's not for lack of legislation and efforts at promoting female participation.
In the decade I just described, at the same time the percentage of women stayed constant, the pool in terms of PhD graduates of women doubled. Now, you're quite right in the fact that if we had paid attention to affirmative action faculty-wise in the 60s when we were growing, it would have been an awful lot easier than in the 70s when we're retrenching. And I'm aware of Dick Lester of Princeton's argument that we may be tampering with meritocracy if we deem to think about affirmative action goals. But I think by and large, to the issue of the self-discipline of our profession, we have really had a miserable record in this regard.
Well, I had in mind Thomas Sowell's research on this subject. He separated out of the women academics. He studied single women and compared them to men of the same age and with the same quality of degree and numbers of publications. And he showed that the women get promoted, get tenure, and are paid as well, or in fact a little better, than comparable men. The big difference comes in married academic women. And he came to the conclusion that the difference is entirely there, that when a single woman academic gets married, she has less time for her career. When a single academic man gets married, he has more time for his career. So his situation improves, hers deteriorates, and what kind of legislation will change that?
Lacking either a woman or a minority member in this panel, I'm hesitant to take on the cause of feminism, but I do.
He didn't say that he liked that situation, but he thought it explained quite a bit.
But I do. I think the basic concern. I'd moved from feminism, perhaps, and minority to the handicap program, which, when I left the university, had just dumped a $5 million facilities bill on us. And I think there's a major legitimate complaint about the characteristic of the intervention of the government at the so-called bureaucratic level. I think Dave and I are both familiar with the capacity or the incapacity of federal agencies to produce the King's English and to say anything that's clear-cut or able to be followed. But that's a different battle. And I guess my basic point is that if this country is unique in saying that the way people have equality of opportunity is through education, if we've made that our bedrock political value, and if over the years systemically we've denied it to minorities and to the majority that are women, then we've asked for the kind of regulation problem we've gotten into.
Dr. Matthews?
Yes, but I think the argument's past that point, Bob. I can't find any great evidence that the way the federal government has approached the problem has really moved us forward. In fact, the statistics that you cite are themselves an indictment of the federal processes which were largely enforced during that period of time.
Would you sort of catalog some of the areas where you feel the way they're going about it is wrong?
Well, to start with, I think that one of the things that's happened is that we have substituted a process for results. We don't judge results now, we judge the process, because we say, well, the results are too hard to really judge, and so we'll judge the steps that you go through. By doing that, by doing what a bureaucracy does naturally, which is to judge process and not results, we have shifted the values, we've shifted the focus, and we've also shifted the behavior. Universities are now going through a great deal of behavior that was different, but the behavior hadn't resulted in any material change in the goals that we thought were important. We have in effect substituted for moral conviction bureaucratic behavior, and I think that's to be regretted. I think that for that reason, it's proper to call into question what this process set off. That does not mean that we question the law. That doesn't mean we question the purpose. But in fact, by focusing on purpose rather than result, we have a great deal of purpose and very little difference in result.
But let's break this down into what I consider, and I'm perfectly willing to stand correct, the two major areas, the housekeeping and the hardware areas, and then the very sensitive area of intrusion upon academic freedom. And let's take the hardware areas first. Is it not inevitable, with so much government funding going into the universities and colleges, that there would be a government entity which would be charged with making sure that the money was spent for the purposes for which it was assigned and making some evaluation as to whether or not it had produced fruitful results? Is there anything wrong with the basic premise that the government, as a prudent manager, has the right to do these things? And if that's true, where have they overdone it? Why is there complaint about it?
I think there's no question but that the government has the right, and in this respect is treating academic institutions as they would treat other institutions with whom it has a contract. The real question becomes a different one. A business, for example, is able to stand government intrusion, or many businesses are, and are able to pass that additional cost of that intrusion in larger employee roles, in larger regulatory agencies that they appoint themselves for that purpose. It is able to pass that on, sometimes I might say to the customer, obviously. In the case of academic institutions, it is also passed on, sometimes in higher tuition fees and all the rest. But what is significant to me is that increasingly all sorts of academic institutions regret, resent, and feel that this intrusion, which adds expense, adds personnel that they would rather in many instances not have to pay for, that may in some instances even cause them to take a person who is essentially an administrator when in fact they would prefer to take someone who is a teacher. All of that is causing them a good deal, or is causing some to complain loudly. The question that I would put, however, is, do we really know who is being hurt by this? And how deep is the financial hurt? And if you are talking about financial hurt, is it not a fact that academic institutions are hurt by any number of other things that government does, including the fact, most obviously, that government is not able to control certain elements of the inflation, the fact that we have a problem of civil disorder in our cities and on campuses infinitely more serious than anything that existed before, and that adds immeasurably to the expense of maintaining order on those campuses, including the fact, I would suspect, that if we looked at the budgets of most colleges and universities, we would find that they are paying more for fuel, that their additional fuel bill is out of all proportion to the additional bill that they are paying for all the regulation that they are exposed to. The question then becomes a very simple one. Yes, it isn't very pleasant to have to do some of these things, but how expensive is it really? And again, what is so interesting in this whole area, we don't have very much information about that.
When you pose the question, does the government have the right to look after the taxpayers? The educator is invariably going to say, of course. But in doing that, he swallows a proposition that he should not swallow. Because from the point of view of the government, the question is not does the government have the right, but can the government carry out its responsibility to do it effectively? And immediately when the educator says, oh, of course they have that right, he buys something he shouldn't buy. He buys too willingly the notion that the government, in carrying out its responsibility, is in effect effective in its execution. The fact of the matter is that the science of government has not progressed to the point that we can say that we are really effective using the tools that we now have in accounting, using the tools that we now have in surveillance, in causing things to happen. Because the government very often interjects itself in such a way that it contaminates the environment and kills those forces that are working for some remediation of the problem. The government is a kind of environmental intrusion, if you will. And the condemnation of the government properly is not from the point of view that he expressed, well, we are really different from businesses and we can't pass this on. It seems to me to frame the question that way is to miss the point. The government is ineffective in what it does, and both from the institutional interest and from the public interest, there is a just criticism. To separate the interest of the government from the interest of the public, I think, is to make a mistake. And I think he has a very good argument if he just frame it a little bit differently, and I encourage a different framing upon him in the interest of justice.
There's another problem.
Goldwyn.
There's another problem in this matter of Congress and the executive branch trying to find out whether they're getting their money's worth in the many things they spend money on in the field of education. Universities and colleges undertake all sorts of different, they have a number of different objectives. Part of what they do is providing services to the public and to different government agencies. And there, I suppose, they ought to be treated as any other contractor. They also have a responsibility for handing on our heritage, a kind of acculturation, what used to be called Americanization. But any good university or college also has one other mission, which is probably the most important, and that is an unqualified search for the truth. And when I say unqualified, I mean not especially American, or if it's a Canadian university or a British university or even a Soviet university. There's no such thing as Soviet truth or British truth. When you're engaged in the real work of a college or university, you're engaged in a mysterious, uncontrollable by a government enterprise. And there is no way that any legislative body, not even the greatest deliberative body in the world, can find out whether they're getting their money's worth.
Well, let me throw a statistic on the table, because I think this...
And when they try to, you see, they distort the whole enterprise.
But we're talking about effectiveness here, and we're talking about the effectiveness of the government, or even its ultimate ability to make judgments. But HEW Inspector General reported that more than 1/3 of $1.2 billion in research contracts in fiscal 1977 was inadequately accounted for by the universities and colleges. In fiscal 1976, according to the General Accounting Office estimate, the Veterans Administration disbursed $823 million in GI benefits to ineligible persons, chiefly because the recipients and the schools failed to fulfill their reporting responsibilities to VA on individual student status. So how effective is the university?
Compared to what?
Compared,
Ineffective accounting compared to what?
There are two things to be said here. One is that David is so eloquent at times, Mr. Moderator, that one hardly dares to examine his logic. But in this instance, to categorize all of government as ineffective in a general bureaucratic term is probably a little too far. The VA figures you cite represented an extremely dumb position of an extremely dumb agency. They really wanted us to take attendance in classes as indicated that, as Bob says, that people are following finding about truth. But the other side of the coin is to remember that the Academy is a pretty loose and strange organization itself. It persistently resists any administrative tidiness. Professors believe that if they have a grant, no one should ask why they're using the long-distance phone or why they can't have a watch line. They believe that their search for truth will be impaired if they do not keep any records at all. And essentially what a university is now, after a period of rapid growth, you've got to remember in 1940, 11% of Americans went on to college. Now 45 to 50%. Enormous transformation at this point. What we are is a labor-intensive industry filled with a labor that is essentially professional. Most of them are neurotic, creative, very untidy individual, and more than half have tenure. So you're going to deal with an equipment budget in which your research laboratories obsolesce at twice the rate of any industrial firm. So you've got a complicated part, and you also have elements of community. You can never expect this outfit to be tidy. On the other hand, you can expect it to address itself to some of the fundamental American rights. And that's a point where I feel most disappointed in our behavior.
Dr. Gray Bart?
Well, I would like to insist that if we really examine the compliance of many institutions, many of whom now have very substantial experience with the federal government, I don't think they're all as untidy as has been suggested by these last remarks. There are a number of institutions in this country that I would now call federal grant universities. If the federal government were, for whatever reason, or if a sufficient number of agencies in the federal government were to suddenly become disenchanted with them, they would quite literally close their doors in a way that any number of other much more modest colleges would not. So the fact of the matter is that a fair number of them are very able to handle the regulatory system that exists, but that doesn't prevent some of them from feeling and from expressing a great concern with the way that the regulation is carried out. And sometimes, particularly when it touches matters of appointment, when it touches what is, for any good university, the heart of the system, which is the character of its faculty. When it is felt that it is touching that, then you do get a certain amount of noise. But again, what is so striking to me is that so far, although there has been a certain amount of noise, and those of us who live in academic institutions are aware of it, so far it has not been translated into political action, which is another way of saying that there is not out there, wherever there is, a vast public that feels that the universities are, in fact, being significantly altered in ways that they find unacceptable. And in this connection, I would say this is one of my arguments, one of my pleas for much greater inquiry in this area. I think it is terribly important for us to begin to understand what the social consequences are. You said a bit earlier, we need to know a great deal more about what is happening to private institutions as a result of this kind of government regulation, of these kinds of government regulations. We need to know what is happening to a lower middle class family in respect to its capacity to choose between private and public institutions, or to choose to send its children to any institution of higher learning. We need to know a great deal more about what is happening to certain disciplines, certain major disciplines because of government appropriations. But I would insist that in this time, we still lack the knowledge that makes it possible to answer even some of the most basic questions in all these areas. And this is one of the reasons why I think you have the kind of difference of opinion that you do have in the country, because actually the factual base is very weak indeed.
Mr. Moderator,
Yes,
I must commend Bob for his useful corrective to a bit of a statement to say, as you just quoted someone saying, that universities have failed to measure up to a certain standard of accounting, conjures up in one's mind that kind of fixed standard that's set by the bar in the high jumpers relay. There are innumerable kinds of accounting standards. They're as varied and soft as anything else. And I would submit that the untidiness within the university is no greater an untidiness than in the accounting field. The second point, though, that I want to make, which it seems to me needs to be made in it, we're discussing the involvement of the federal government as if it were doing something very peculiar in causing something called bureaucratization within the university. We're talking about bureaucratization as if it were imposed by the federal government, perhaps by the state government. The fact of the matter is, and I think if you could compel all of those present to be honest, and the audience as well, they would have to admit this, that bureaucratization is a state of mind, and it is something that we have done to ourselves within institutions and within systems of institutions and within educational bureaucracies at the state and the federal level, and that unless we correct and challenge this penchant, we will not deliver ourselves from what afflicts us. To attend to it at one point and not to attend to it in another is to fail to understand what causes our dilemma.
Do you really favor the debureaucratization of the university?
Indeed, sir, I do.
Then what would you do about the University of Alabama? For instance, I have a recommendation that you reduce the size by about, tenfold, because no one has figured out a way to conduct the work of a university as a community, given the size of our institutions. I don't know when it started happening, but they've grown to giant size.
Anybody
The
else
question
want to
is, you've got to come to some grips in how to make that institution function. And I guess my argument is really that we have come lately on the scene. We've usually tolerated management by amateurs in education. You made a man a dean because he didn't really write his journal article on time, and then you made him a provost because he was unpopular with the department chairman. And the need primarily for just some professional management in the academic area, though it goes very much against our tradition. We still like to love and think about Mr. Chips. It seems to me is preeminent. One final note on this: all of what we've been talking about are real and serious problems, and federal government intrusion particularly. But I would say for most of colleges and universities, public and private, the critical interface will be and is with the state governments, and that as private institutions come to look to state government, and as public institutions undertake to maintain our independence, where the issue of can we maintain the pursuit of truth, which Bob has put his finger on as our basic mission, we're far more likely to have difficulty in the state houses and in the legislatures and gubernatorial realms than we are with the president and the Congress.
Well, in terms of the time that we have tonight for this discussion, let's come to that sensitive area, away from the hardware and the counting procedures, etc., academic freedom. Now, what does the term academic freedom mean? Is it possible to arrive at a definition that can be used, for instance, by government to draw a line beyond which government cannot pass? Who would define academic freedom?
I wouldn't try to define it, but I can talk about it. There's no doubt that there's a tremendous public interest of the whole people in the quality of education and study, research that goes on in any kind of society. No society can claim to be outstanding or great if it doesn't have a great intellectual heritage that is strong and influences the whole society. Now, the big question is, what can a government or any outside organization that is outside the academic sphere itself, what can they do to foster it? One of the best things they can do is to keep their hands off. At least that has been the experience in the United States and in much of the Western world. When they try to encourage, direct, steer the academic enterprise for the public good, they usually mess things up and frequently have a restraining effect, because it's one of these mysteries of the educational process is that you never know where the good things are going to come from. Academic freedom, I understand to mean the best that the community can do to help education. That is, by and large, leave them alone to their own devices and not tell them what to study or what conclusions to come to.
All right, let's come to agree. Is the federal government invading the academic freedoms?
May I try to answer that and begin by reminding you that the tradition of academic freedom goes back a very long time. It goes back, if you want, to the beginnings of the university. The university was once an independent corporation, a corporation into which the state could not intrude, as other corporations were. Gradually, through this freedom, there developed that extraordinary scholarship which at times has been centered in universities, not always, but at times has been centered in universities. Today, and this is a unique situation, you must remember that for most of the history of universities, the great donors to scholarship were not necessarily, particularly in this country, were not necessarily public bodies. They might have been individuals. But for the first time, given what has happened to scholarship, given the expense of scholarship, it has developed that really in certain fields, particularly in certain of the sciences and certain other fields, the federal government particularly is the great donor. And the great question that has come up, and a question that has come up insistently from groups that obviously do have access to their federal legislators, to others who are political persons, the question that has come up and must come up is for an activity that is essentially publicly funded, for an activity that where clearly there is a public interest in it, for an activity where, most importantly, there is and must be social consequences, whether there is not some need to change what I would call the old form of contract between the researcher and the society, which was a contract of very considerable freedom, of not absolute freedom, but of very considerable freedom. May I give just one small example? One of the questions that has recently been discussed in the journal that I edit, Daedalus, is the following. Let us imagine that you as a medical researcher could discover a way to prolong all the lives of most of the people in this room by something like 20 or 30 years. But those last 20 or 30 years would be lived in what we would call today in medical terms a vegetable-like existence. We would be there, but we wouldn't be very active, and we certainly would not be working. We would not be in any sense productive members of that society. The author in Daedalus, Robert Morrison, asks the very simple question, is that a form of research that the society could interfere to stop? How would it do it? How would you know how to stop it? Has it any right to stop it? Who is to determine that? I think a great many questions of that sort are beginning to come on the horizon. This is what the whole controversy on DNA is about.
I was going to say, you come, John, to head on this one with DNA in the terms of, do you allow that that kind of research, life-creating research, to go on under what standards of control and whose? Community, academic, federal, or state? And that issue is going to really have to be faced up to within the next 2 or 3 years.
But specifically on terms of allowing the research or on terms of denying funds to continue the research?
Of allowing the research. The question of whether the social consequences are not so hazardous. In other words, there really is a public interest, as is obvious. There is a public interest which is so insistent, or there are public groups who so much insist that certain forms of research are too dangerous to undertake.
And therefore, this would be considered a reasonable area to consider the invasion of academic freedom was.
But that is not what, may I say, the scientific community itself would be split on this, with the overwhelming number feeling that I think the overwhelming number would feel that the original contract, which has worked for most of history, should be maintained. That is what is so important, that the scientific community feels that, but there are individual groups, and they have asserted themselves in various cities where there are major laboratories intending to do such research.
Just for the television audience, will you just explain DNA very briefly so they know what it is?
Well, this is new research which is thought to create the possibility of the generation of a mutant that could be very dangerous and that could in time, if you will, have infectious and other consequences and unknown consequences which could be dangerous to life.
All right, now let's come into the area. Where is academic freedom being invaded? There is the case of the third-year medical student admissions, which the medical schools have resisted. Will somebody cover that and tell me, do you feel that was an intrusion by government that was unwarranted and possibly illegal?
Mr. Chairman, I feel like I'm participating in a discussion in which the conferees are trying to decide whether their present condition is different from the land of Oz. The land of Oz never existed, and I really don't see the profit in a discussion in which we try to decide whether we were ever in some place that never existed at all. The notion that the academy was separate from the state is not supported by any history I have ever seen. Why we persist in that illusion, I do not know. The academy and the community have always been bound together. The point I want to make is that the academy, I think, best understands its relationship to society as a bonded one. It at times has been supported by the king, and sometimes by the church, and sometimes by NIH. But despite the differences in theology between those three parties, they are in fact organizations of society to influence the academic community in various ways. I think for us to take the position that we are guarding our purity is to make it impossible for us to create the kind of political alliance that my distinguished and learned and basically correct colleague wishes to establish, because it says that we are somehow different. I think the best way to talk about our freedom is simply to say that we need only that kind of latitude to do the things that we do in such a way that the raw and undigested political forces, whether they be of church or of state or NIH, do not so interfere with what we do that social benefit cannot be derived from them. I think to talk that way is to understand our history, and I think more to the point, to talk that way is to allow others who have similar concerns in our time right now about regulation to join with us in getting some relief. If we persist in talking of ourselves as separate and distinct, we make it perfectly impossible, I assure you, from political perspective, if not from historical. to form the kind of alliances that will give some relief to the academy.
All right, now,
Mr. Matthews, could I answer that? I really feel I have to. The idea that we were talking about something separate and distinct, that it had no relations with the community, that it did not draw from. I mean, nobody said that. What I am talking about is what you, as a head of a state institution, know to have been true. That is, for the whole of the 19th century, these state universities were concerned with a certain kind of independence of state legislatures. There were various devices for securing that independence. This was one of the ways in which boards of trustees were used, and when they were too much under the influence of state authority, it was felt that in some way the authority of the university was being vitiated. What I'm suggesting to you is that the scientists and most other scholars believed, and it was a fact, that for a very long time they could pursue unhindered their research, which was, as you said earlier, an inquiry, or which was said here earlier, an inquiry into the truth. They were permitted to pursue that unhindered. At various times, there were various kinds of interventions. Usually, those interventions were followed by some complaint from those who believed that the university had a different tradition. Now, you cannot simply argue that the university has simply been under the control of others and then mix up church and state and make it appear as if the church is the state, and those are just not possible. And I'm going to talk even of the 17th and 18th century in this country. Obviously, these were not free of the community. Nobody has suggested that. Nobody is, again, the word that is most offensive is a word which is commonly used about the university and is least truthful about it, namely the idea of the university as an ivory tower. That is simply not what it has been. But there is something different between being an ivory tower and being essentially the agency of the state. And when, for example, men in the 19th century contrasted various university systems, they often contrasted it precisely on that basis. The University of Moscow, created in 1755, was different from the University of Oxford or Cambridge in the 18th and 19th and 20th century.
David, let me agree with you on one very important point, that any educational institution is not only bonded to the society, but it's a creature of the society. It has no independent means of support. It either gets its sustenance from the government or from elements of the society, but it has no way of sustaining itself. It's a very weak, fragile institution. And that's one of the reasons that doctrines like academic freedom have had to be concocted, given meaning, and been spread in the most persuasive ways one could devise in a society, because that's about their only protection.
The issue really is the character, Bob, of the bond. And Steve, I think the point is one cannot simply accept a role such as an agency or a business firm. It's a different kind of institution. How we negotiate and how we maintain our independence is really at the heart of the argument.
Well, in a non-Oz way, land of Oz way, instead of talking of education simply, we can talk about all the tax-exempt charitable organizations defined by law as distinct from other kinds of non-government corporations. They have a special standing in society. It's a public policy decision that many enterprises of great importance to the whole society will be run by non-government people. And the need for that independence in universities and colleges is the same for the so-called public ones as the so-called private ones.
Now, let me usurp a moment to ask one question, if I may. In the case of the admissions, third-year admissions in medical schools, in the case of some relief from the safety and handicap regulations under affirmative action, the educational community has, to use that dreadful verb, lobbied effectively on Capitol Hill. Is not a solution to many of the problems which we've been discussing here tonight a further development of these skills in the educational community so that they get to legislation in its formative stage before correction has to be done to harm already on the legislative books?
Dr. Gray Bart is going to say yes, and I'm going to say no.
Splendid.
Because having participated in the very debates that he describes, that is the debate over the foreign medical graduates, the debate over handicap, I would have to report to the academic community that its force in the halls of politics is negligible, if not non-existent. The fact of the matter is that the educational community has a good deal of political work yet to do.
Let me come back to this thing. Do I sense from this panel that you do not feel that at this moment in time, albeit the example of the attempt by the government to order medical schools to admit a certain percentage of third-year people who had medical education overseas, you do not feel that academic freedom, as of right now, is seriously threatened or has been seriously invaded by government?
Oh, I do.
I would say
we all agree to that.
In that instance, certainly.
One
is very happy that a group of very powerful institutions were willing to say no to that. And having said no, you found the government acceding to that no. That is a clear instance.
Well, I think what we're differing on is how we frame the case so as to have the public to understand the grounds on which we differ. And I think the disagreement among us here is that some of us would frame the case in such a way as we talk about the university's distinctiveness. And there are distinctions. There are others of us who, in the same interest, would say we should frame the case differently. We should talk about our similarities. And that's really the difference between my colleague here and me. And you should not mistake the vigor at which we go at terms like state and church to misunderstand that we're actually talking on the same point. But like all good members of the academy, we would go at it in such a way as to give you the impression that we were on utterly opposite sides of the issue.
All right, I think this is a good time, Doctor, if we may, because the time is running.
Why the rest of the community never understands us.
This concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our heartfelt thanks to the distinguished panelists, Dr. Robert Goldwyn, Dr. David Matthews, Dr. Robert Wood, and Dr. Stephen Gray Bart.
This public policy forum on the government and academia has brought you the views of 4 experts in the field. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackis in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20036.